soils, and the under drain is raised at the top of that gravel storage layer, acts as basically an overflow to make sure that the growing media doesn't remain saturated. And so you get treatment, filtration, infiltration as much as your native soils allow, and then it backs up and discharges to the MS4 after filtration. And that's the end. Okay, thank you.
I guess this is a heads up to staff, Region 3, as well as Janine, who's not paying attention to me. I think I would like to hear from the NGO panel first, but then I would like to go back to this presentation and walk through and discuss some of the points that have been raised and hear from staff as well as Region 3 on them.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppin, members of the board. I'm Noah Garrison with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm going to be speaking today with Sean Bothwell of the California Coast Keeper Alliance and Kirsten James of Heal the Bay. And I'll try to keep my portion of this presentation short, if I can figure out how to, there we go. Okay, before we get into sort of the specifics of the permit and the regulatory aspect, I do want to, again, sort of point out the critical nature of this permit and why it's so important before the board. And that is that stormwater pollution is a real and growing problem in this state. The more we develop, the more we are contributing runoff and pollution to our waters. And as the permit itself points out, that it is a leading source of pollution for 10% of our rivers and our lakes and 17% of estuaries, and a vastly greater percentage of waters. It's a leading source of pollution. So there is a real need to address this issue. And again, this is a problem for where we live. It's the rivers that we live around. It's the beaches we live around. It's where our families and friends and visitors to the state recreate. There are real health impacts and real economic impacts from failing to address stormwater pollution. And so I hope the board will take that in consideration rather than just looking at the sort of the regulatory and legal aspect, but what the impacts of failing to address stormwater runoff are. With that in mind, I'm now going to get into the regulatory and legal aspects of this. I'm going to skip through this very quickly. The board is certainly aware of the MEP standard and that this is an evolving standard. It is not fixed in time, so that this permit absolutely will contain greater and more stringent requirements than the last round of permit or the last round of other permits, including phase 1 permits throughout the state. And I think that board staff have certainly done a very good job of incorporating new provisions into this, this permit so far. I do want to quickly address the receiving water limitations. The Supreme Court was gracious enough to issue an opinion this morning in order that this board could have something to work with. Critically, the Supreme Court ruled on a very, very narrow issue in the Los Angeles County case and did not in any way address or implicate the receiving water limitations. Those standards stay in place. They have been upheld by state courts. They have been upheld by federal courts. And there is absolutely nothing by the Supreme Court decision that should sway your determination to leave those standards in place. I do want to move to the post-construction standards then, and that's sort of primarily what I think discussion has been about, at least with regard to the Region 3 requirements. The first point I'll make just is that low impact development as a baseline standard, this is a cost-effective, superior method of addressing stormwater runoff. Not only is it the best means that we have right now for dealing with the pollution, but it provides multiple benefits, and that's something that I think that this permit could actually be strengthened in with regard to the other benefits that can be provided while we're addressing the stormwater pollution. So there are a couple of sort of specific issues that I think that we'd like to raise with the permit. Again, I really do want to commend staff. I think in particular their interest in addressing stormwater pollution through the design of projects and early on in project conception really is a strong approach, and it's really good to see that they're looking at trying to take this on as something to be thought at every stage throughout the development of a project, rather than as once a design is submitted and once somebody's already figured out how they're going to put their site together. And so I think the approach they've taken is really commendable. That being the case, there are minimum standards that do need to be met. And to begin with, I think at a minimum, it needs to be clear that this permit has to require retention with no discharge of the 85th percentile storm where that's feasible through any means that can be achieved of retention. That means infiltration, harvesting and reuse, which of course provides a water supply benefit, or evapotranspiration. And I think it was raised earlier that there are places in this permit and also in the Central Coast documents that point only to infiltration or only to one means or another in order to achieve retention. And for development in this state, we should be looking at every means of obtaining retention. To that end, I think that this permit could benefit from allowing a greater deal of flexibility to allow for regional projects, particularly regional projects that are going to increase water supply. If there's an opportunity for groundwater recharge, for spreading fields, for large-scale capture projects that might be off-site but will occur prior to discharge of any runoff from a development to receiving water, so basically downstream of a development project, but before that runoff would reach a receiving water, the permit really should take advantage of those. We have absolutely tremendous opportunity to increase water supplies in the state, and this permit is a perfect vehicle for doing so. And to the extent that we can do it without increasing the amount of discharge of pollutants or the discharge of runoff to receiving waters, but still make use of the runoff from new development, redevelopment, or retrofit sites, we really should be taking advantage of that. Finally, I think some issues were raised about inconsistency with the permit, particularly with regard to the Region 3 Central Coast standards. And I think that I would clarify that to say that those aren't inconsistencies. I think that's part of MEP. This permit needs to set a baseline standard that the runoff from the 85th percentile storm, where it's feasible, absolutely needs to be retained on site for water quality as well as for quantity, velocity, and other hydromodification reasons. That's absolutely critical. And the permit provides off-ramps in the case that that's not feasible, and it should. It's appropriate to provide off-ramps for infeasibility cases, so long as it will still result in protection. But where, as the Central Coast standard or any other standard that's going to come up through this permit, where additional runoff retention is feasible, where the 95th percentile storm may be retained, or the 90th percentile storm, or using some other standard that will be in excess of the 85th percentile storm, and that's going to result not only in less pollution occurring, but also in less hydromodification effects on, particularly on smaller streams throughout the state. That's something that absolutely should be undertaken, and that's exactly what the MEP standard contemplates, that if it's practicable to do that and a higher standard can be achieved, it really should be being implemented. So with that, I think we'll say, without passing any judgment or comment on the Central Coast standards themselves, we think that this permit should require a minimum hydromodification standard once the reopener occurs, which it's not entirely clear from my reading at least that it's required to occur, it's just that it may occur. And I apologize to staff if I'm missing a provision in the permit. But as far as hydromodification goes, there should be minimum standards in this permit. Once the reopener occurs and a process has gone through where we can see what the exact runoff rates or what scientifically is the best method for each individual region or each individual water, then you can apply a more stringent or a more detailed standard. But this permit should have a minimum standard in place to start with. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean Bothwell from California Coastkeeper Alliance. And thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Sean Bothwell from the California Coastkeeper Alliance. Today my comments will focus on Section E1B of the MS4 Phase 2 permit, which provides an executive officer with the discretion to disregard the permit, thus constituting illegal self-regulation. Eliminating meaningful agency review and public participation violates fundamental provisions of the Clean Water Act. Sorry, I missed my thing. How did you do this? Oh, there we go. Sorry, this is my first time with this. You can roll with that. All right. In Environmental Defense Center versus US EPA, the Ninth Circuit made clear that agency review and public participation are critical to advance the goals of the Clean Water Act, and therefore public opportunity is required in the permitting process. Section E1B of the draft permit effectively allows permittees or regional executive officers to rewrite critical sections of the permit without public input or adequate oversight by the State Water Board. Also, in the previous version of the permit, Section E1B specified that all permittees must implement post-construction and monitoring programs. The provision has been deleted from this revised draft permit. The other draft permit The revised draft permit also states that 2 of the permit's goals is to include specific and comprehensive stormwater monitoring and incorporate more low-impact development strategies. Deleting section E1B's requirement that all permittees must implement new post-construction and monitoring programs does not achieve those stated goals. Finally, the language found in section E1B suggests that the State Water Board believes the revised draft permit contains weaker BMP requirements than what permittees are currently implementing. If BMPs are currently being implemented that are more effective than the proposed requirements in this permit, then the State Water Board must incorporate those BMPs into the permit to meet the MEP standard and meet the Clean Water Act. In summation, we believe section E1B is problematic. If the section remains in the permit, we request that at a minimum, the section state that all permittees must implement post-construction and monitoring programs, similar to what Noah said earlier, that there needs to be a foundation. It should also be clear that this section does not apply to receiving water limitations. And finally, we ask that the State Water Board review the most effective BMPs currently being implemented and incorporate them into the permit to meet the MEP standard. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kirsten from Heal the Bay.
Good afternoon, Kirsten James with Heal the Bay. I'm going to focus my comments primarily on the monitoring section. As you all know, the NPDES permit must require the discharger to conduct water quality monitoring that's sufficient to determine whether or not the discharger is complying with the permit requirements. So as we've reviewed the proposed monitoring section, we've used this filter to look at the program, and we urge that you do the same. So today I want to discuss a little bit about why we think the current proposal doesn't meet this goal and is insufficient and unlawful. Staff has talked a lot in their response to comments about the cost of monitoring programs, and we understand that it can be a costly endeavor, but in order to make real progress, to be able to track pollution, we do need a robust program that really meets those goals. And on the plane ride up here, I was trying to refresh my memory, since there's been several drafts of this permit, how the permit has progressed in this area specifically. And unfortunately, it's very much regressed in our opinion. Just a few highlights, in the first draft back in June of 2011, we saw traditional permittees and non-traditional. We saw a fairly robust receiving water monitoring program. We saw a specific program for triggers and follow-up action. We saw toxicity monitoring and a TIE and TRE process, which you all have become experts at. And so now, looking at today, we see, a much higher threshold for applicability, only traditional. We see a number of off-ramps. The specific triggers have been removed. And so that just put it in perspective to me to see, while cost is being considered here, just in fact how far we see that it's regressed. So, I'd like to say to you today, let's go back to June 2011, but, at the same time, I want to be realistic. And so today, what I want to do is just offer some language suggestions that, we really believe can make us move forward in this, and hopefully are reasonable in your eyes as well. So I'm just going to briefly go through those. So I mentioned applicability. The permit limits monitoring to permittees that are falling under specific categories. And then there's a bit of an off-ramp that we see as a loophole for those that, may be conducting ASBS, TMDL, or 303D monitoring, which are all very important programs, and we agree that those should be prioritized, but those aren't necessarily in and of themselves sufficient. Again, that filter I was mentioning, to really understand if the permittees are complying with the permit. So we really don't see those as an appropriate reason to exclude, the regular monitoring. For example, you might have a TMDL in one reach for one pollutant, and presumably that could be an off-ramp to additional receiving water monitoring. So in this slide, we're just asking you to remove that limitation and what we see as an off-ramp.
Kirsten, before you move on,
Sure.
Instead of removing that language, have you given some thought about further expanding that to be more specific in terms of the current monitoring efforts that are underway for ASBS's TMDO 303D listing that would be more acceptable to you, I guess, is the phrase I'm looking for, in this provision?
Yeah, well, we could definitely look at that and talk to staff about it. It's a little tricky because I think I mentioned in one of my previous testimony that, you know, ideally it would be great to have a map, statewide map that shows, you know, what monitoring is being done on through all these programs, so we really know where the gaps may and may not be. And there's no map that I know of that really shows that. So it might be site specific, you know, but we can definitely explore that with staff. This was just sort of an easy fix that I saw as far as, you know, obviously we don't want duplicative monitoring, you know, there's no use in that, but perhaps merging and taking the balance of the two somehow.
I, for one, would encourage you to explore that with staff.
Okay, I will do. Thank you. So this next point is dealing with receiving water monitoring. This will look familiar. It's the exact same slide. But basically, I want to highlight your attention to the two bullets. In this current draft, it's my interpretation that staff is proposing that a special study can be done in lieu of receiving water monitoring, if I'm interpreting that correctly. And so, you know, we don't see that as a sufficient set of monitoring to necessitate removing receiving water monitoring. Staff gives a couple examples of, for example, looking at the effectiveness of restoration as a special study. And I ask you, can anyone tell me why determining the effectiveness of a restoration effort tells you anything about your compliance with your permit? It's not matching up to me. So while special studies can be very beneficial, not saying to remove that entirely, but as far as, you know, the minimum requirements, we really do need to see that receiving water monitoring remain and there be no off-ramps for that.
Actually, could you go back?
Sure.
I'm going to keep interrupting you and now ask staff, before we move on and I lose my train of thought on these things, what was staff's thinking in terms of the inclusion of the special studies?
So the special studies was just, it's an effort to look at these different programs throughout the state, and some folks have restoration programs, for example, that's looking at the receiving water, and if you are monitoring for if that's working, if we take a step back and look at the watershed as a whole, it can be effective at looking at stormwater in your program. So it was, again, trying to leverage existing efforts and where they are in place, and that's just one of the examples.
So can we at least look at narrowing that language so that the special study that would qualify has a direct linkage to what we're looking to ascertain?
Right, to program. And I think the big goal in special studies was looking at program effectiveness and to see if you're monitoring to see if certain components of your stormwater program are effective. So that was the overarching goal there, but we can do that, yeah.
Great. Okay, and then this slide is again just the same issue in another place as far as you know, having the special study be a substitute. So moving on to regional monitoring, you know, Heal the Bay, we all support the concept of regional monitoring. We always have. It's very important to, you know, combine resources and try to, you know, cost effectively pursue monitoring programs. However, I interpret the proposed language as an off-ramp again to receiving water monitoring and the goals and requirements of receiving water monitoring. So perhaps it's just some clarification that's needed. But here's a simple suggestion that I think better gets at the point of, you know, we encourage these regional programs to help share costs and implement these, you know, requirements effectively, but that doesn't mean those requirements in E13 should be, you know, removed. And so that's our point there.
I guess this is a question for Emil. Reading that, I mean, that certainly captures at least my intent, or what I believe to be the intent of this this section. But is there a particular legal concern in terms of the way that Kirsten is proposing this language? Did you specifically mention the monitoring requirements in section E13I4 actually that's not for, that's whatever, for a particular legal reason why it's in there?
Why we can't phrase it the way it's phrased here?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think this captures what staff
The intent
intended to
is.
capture. And I'm just looking at staff to see if they agree. And I don't see any reason why it couldn't be worded in this manner if that provides clarification for what staff was looking for.
Thank you.
That would be helpful, thank you. And again, this is just the same thing. It's, the idea of regional monitoring shouldn't be, removing these specific requirements. So that's another section of language that I would ask staff to take a look at and make sure the intent is there as well. Another just side note, I think this language that your staff is proposing is a little bit tricky here, just as a stated goal for the monitoring program for the urban-rural interface. Definitely, we all are, obviously, as Noah was saying, very supportive of LID requirements in the permit. However, not sure if within 2 years we're really going to see a big change just with the slow level of development and redevelopment, and I would hesitate to put that as the sole goal of the receiving water monitoring at the urban-rural interface, because there's obviously other goals associated with that, and I think that could just be a little bit tricky and misinterpreted.
But I actually like that goal. So
I think it can be tricky if in 2 years that's what you hope, the sole goal to hope you get out of that. Perhaps a few additional goals could be added, just so that it doesn't all hinge on that one goal. If the rate of redevelopment is really slow and monitoring is not going to pick up much of anything if you don't really have any significant change there. So something to consider. Moving on to a separate but related topic, program effectiveness. Again, we've seen a lot of changes in this section of the permit over the various iterations. One of the big changes in this last iteration was the removal of a lot of the quantification of pollutant loading, and a more rigorous effort there, which we would like to see back in, but here is just a simple change that we think would go a long way. Instead of putting in some arbitrary prioritized BMPs to evaluate and look at effectiveness, to go back to the previous language, which is just BMPs or group of BMPs. It's very arbitrary to say what those prioritized BMPs would be, and hopefully all BMPs are being looked at for performance. Okay, so just a few other quick things, and then I'll wrap up. In relation to TMDLs, we need to make sure that they're fully implemented through this permit. And staff is proposing to extend the consultation with regional boards from 6 months to a year. We're already very disappointed that it's they're not in there in this permit, as we believe they should be in full effect, and the robust TMDLs with all the waste load allocations and implementation. So we, at a minimum, we think you should go back to that 6 months consultation. As far as let's see. I guess that's it. And then just to sum up all of our thoughts, as Noah highlighted, we need to ensure that the receiving water limits stay in the permit and apply without exception. For LID, we need to make sure that there is the retention requirement of the 85th percentile storm, unless it's determined it's infeasible. And just of note, we see a difference between retention and through bio retention versus biofiltration. An underdrain is a discharge to an MS4, so you need to be careful of that distinction, and that should only be in cases of complete infeasibility. So please keep that in mind. Also, we need to see some minimum hydromodification thoughts in this permit. And with regard to authority, as Sean highlighted, you know, we need to make sure that there's meaningful agency and public review for all of the key elements of the permit. And then we ask you to consider those monitoring changes that I highlighted to help strengthen the monitoring program. And we do want to give a special thanks to staff for all their collaboration and discussion with regards to this permit. Thank you.
Kirsten, there's one thing you left out. When you opened up, you mentioned that this may not be lawful. Would you like to share with us why this isn't a lawful permit?
So what I mean by that is in regards, and Noah might have some additions on his sections, but as far as the monitoring, so the filter that I mentioned where, you know, the Clean Water Act requires that NPDES programs fully ensure that they can evaluate the permittee's discharge. We believe that a more robust program would be helpful in determining that. So that's what I meant by that.
Fran?
I have actually a question for Noah. Noah, and it was repeated by Kirsten, but you made the point first, so I'll talk to you. The idea that you have on-site retention except where infeasible. And so there's no thought as to if you've got a cost-effective way of doing something in the block, but not at house by house. That, I mean, that, and it may not be infeasible to do it at the house, but you can actually maintain it if it's done at the block level, or if it's done, you know, at the park that's at the end of the block, or, you know, and you've, I mean, we know a lot of the stuff that's going on in LA, and what we've found, if I understand it correctly, is that if you go house by house, some homeowners and some business owners are great at operation and maintenance of their system, and some are completely lousy. And so don't we really want to be more, I mean, we definitely want to keep it as close to where the rain falls as possible, and we want the buildings to be done in a way that encourage retention. But isn't there any room there for flexibility?
Absolutely, and I think I apologize if I gave the impression that on-site is the only solution, particularly with the regards to the water supply projects. I tried to speak to that. I think the way I would put it is that all things being equal and with no other benefit being derived from it, the preference that we have is for a site level, you know, on-site retention of the stormwater runoff. Where there's a benefit, like a regional project would provide water supply or habitat or something else, and will still in itself not result in any net increase or difference in the discharge to an MS4. So say you have a subdivision, and downstream of that subdivision, but before it will actually hit the receiving water, you could put in a park or some other feature and provide a regional retention project, then absolutely, we have no problem with that. And the same thing on a block-by-block basis, or you know, small grouping of houses or commercial developments, so long as it is prior to discharge to the MS4 or to a receiving water, we typically don't have any issue with that. In fact, there may be reasons why it's beneficial to do it in a larger scale project. The concern we have is that for the most part, when MS4 permits started looking at retention and then offsite mitigation, there was no distinction made between those projects that capture the same runoff that comes from the development, but maybe in a regional setting, and true offsite mitigation, which is to say selecting a project somewhere else in the watershed that some other site will drain to, and then just treating the runoff from the new development and allowing that to eventually discharge into the receiving water. And the reason is that it's incredibly difficult to make sure that you're achieving the same pollutant load reduction, that you're not having some alternative impact on the receiving water that would occur at location A but won't occur across the watershed at location B. So our take is that in particular where you can have a development, a group of developments, an isolated series of developments, all of which could drain to, say, a regional project, but their runoff is going to that regional project and not just being treated and discharged to the MS4, and then a regional project is being done somewhere else, that's fine. Where you're doing offsite mitigation where project A is just going to treat and discharge, and they're going to retrofit a building 2 miles away within the same watershed, and hopefully the pollutant load reduction is the same, and the impacts to the receiving water are the same, and any other impact that we could thought of are the same. That's where we have real concerns because it's very difficult to demonstrate that. So absolutely, we think that small-scale, sub-regional or regional projects are definitely a way we can go. We just want to make sure it's actually taking the same runoff and making use of that, as opposed to trying to apply it at some other site that's completely hydrologically not connected to the new development or redevelopment site.
Question for staff. Since the slide is up here, I wanted to follow up on it. When staff made the revision to add the words, to focus on prioritize BMPs, how significant of a change is it? I mean, I assume you did that as part of your evaluations for cost effectiveness. How significant is the group of prioritized BMPs versus just BMPs in general?
I think, yeah, like you said, we were trying to focus on cost here with this, and if we look at the prioritized BMPs, it's looking at those priority areas and focusing efforts there. The benefit of that is you have, if there are a lot of BMPs in a program, you're focusing your efforts so you can have more effective analysis of those versus the group. I mean, we could, I don't know cost-wise how that would work, looking at the two.
Well, for me, the important, one of the important parts of this section is that linkage to quantitative data. And so I think one of the challenges we've had all along is not all BMPs will lend itself to that kind of quantitative data.
Right.
At least I don't think so. So for those BMPs that do have that aspect, do we need to further prioritize it?
Well, the way I was taking it, and so you can answer us both together, I was assuming that by focusing on TMDLs, which are a statewide priority, national priority actually, and ASBSs, that you would actually be able to, at the end of the permit cycle, have some measurable changes that either happened or didn't. And you, rather than allowing people to kind of pick their favorite BMP and stick it wherever they wish for whatever reason, it wouldn't be, it's just not measurable. Because usually these BMP, I mean, a lot of these BMPs are going to be small, particularly in small places. And so, and you've got maybe big receiving waters that are going to have a hard time showing stuff anyway. But at least you're kind of piling on in a positive way. That's how I was taking it, and that was the reason I thought picking some focus was a good idea for measurability, very much along the lines that you're talking.
And we've also, to add to that too, with the reporting requirements, so now we have the certification that it's been completed, then we also tie to each of those program elements. You come back to this program effectiveness plan and make the tie of that, the effectiveness of those BMPs for those specific program elements as you're moving through the permit term too. So it kind of comes around in that way too, to focus efforts.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have one other question, that is on the idea of retention, meaning not just infiltration, but actually making use of the water that you've retained. And that's, again, that's a huge selling factor, I think, to cities and communities that are looking for ways to have more water in their groundwater basins for future use, or in cisterns or wherever. Why isn't that more spelled out?
I think, Fran, we really place a lot of emphasis on the basic site design measures, so that's pretty much the first thing you're doing. It kicks in at a pretty low threshold, 2,500 square feet, but we're actually trying to make use of the different sort of hydrologic pathways that exist on a natural site. And so we give credit for planting trees and knowing that trees can actually intercept rainfall before it ends up becoming a runoff issue. And so we try to do it, I think, at that level, at that site design first tier level. And so I think that's...
Could you at the same time encourage people to put in a you know, a cistern, a cistern fence, if they, that, why not?
Yeah, there's a business opportunity, right? It is encouraged right now. In fact, one of the things we do, we make use of the credit system that we have in the construction permit where, if you implement these basic site design measures, you can actually relate it back to a reduction in that 85th percentile storm volume just through the site design. So instead of going right through sort of a planter, bioretention, we do place significant emphasis on doing some basic site design, soil amendment, cisterns, planting trees, that sort of thing. So I think that's really what we try. We try to strike that balance and prioritize that.
Yeah, I'm a little confused about Mr. Garrison's emphasis on the 85th percentile when it's pretty clear that that's our sizing criteria under E12. Is it because it doesn't say retain versus the infiltrate, harvest, use, or evapotranspire transpire or biotreat? I mean, what's the problem with the existing draft permit in relation to Mr. Garrison's comment?
I'm going to speak for Mr. Garrison. Should you? I mean, I think.
Eric or no?
I mean, I appreciate the comment, but was that a comment that something needs to change in the draft permit, or have we already addressed it?
I think to my reading, there are areas of the post-construction or development restrictions that appear to be a little bit vague as to allowances for biofiltration that would result in discharge, or potentially for some of the off-ramps that I would like to see clarified just to make sure. But absolutely, it certainly appears from all ratings that is the baseline standard. I'd just like to make sure there aren't off-ramps that would be inappropriate as opposed to off-ramps for infeasibility or where it's truly necessary.
Okay, all right, so yeah.
And then certainly where a higher standard could be reached as per, say, the Central Coast or other provisions or approaches that come in where a higher standard could be reached, we would support that.
Right, yeah, having the flexibility. Okay. Yeah, because I think, one of the issues, with this type of sizing criteria, by necessity and simplicity, it has a static nature to it. And yet, over the course of of a winter that we're going through right now, you have a dynamic nature of the ability of a site to infiltrate. At a certain point, you get to a saturation point. So from a civil engineer's perspective, I'm nervous about requiring retention no matter what without some kind of civil engineering-based failure mode that allows an overflow to MS4. So when I see that underdrain, the simple diagram we saw, that underdrain feature to me is critical. And then, the retention design parameter is based on the size, the area, the volume of the bed that's below the overflow. But because of the dynamic nature of infiltration over the course of soil saturation, that sort of thing, I think the design standards have to have these type of failure overflow designs. And so I get nervous about saying retain no matter what, because there's also beneficial use benefit of having flow-through systems. One thing that I picked up on, and I may have over-interpreted, but during Mr. Rock's presentation, when he was describing the technical basis for the 95th percentile retention criteria and where it might apply, which has been a point of much discussion and comment, he seemed to emphasize that, well, it wasn't so much, it has a water quality benefit, but it seemed to me, based on what he described, it was really targeted toward areas that are suitable for infiltration on that level. That it was a water supply driver in certain areas of the Central Coast, which is very relevant, and that's where Central Coast is actually, from a statewide perspective, is well positioned, not only because of its predominance of Phase 2 jurisdictions, but because of water supply limitations that, I was hearing from Central Coast, and I would like any clarification if you like, that the 95th percentile type application was in areas where there was groundwater recharge and water supply benefit perhaps much more than the water supply, water quality benefit. And I think that's a really important point, and it's important to me as a state board member looking at water supply and water quality issues.
All right, I have some questions, but I think I'll wait for all the comments to come through, and it gets to more of the regional
Mr.
opportunity.
Luke, you and Mr. Jacobson like to come up? You coming together or separately, or how are you doing that?
Fine, thank you. My name is Bob Lucas. I'm here representing SWRCB, California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. And I'm here today. I'm accompanied by Fred Jacobson, who's with San Diego Gas and Electric, and also representing the SoCal Gas Company. First, I'd like to thank the staff for the changes that they've made to date. We think that the document is getting better. However, we do think that there's still room for some more changes to be made. We did submit a comment letter on December 17th. I'd ask you to be patient and try to read it. There's a lot of words in there. We have included some recommendations for refinements that we think would make the permit that much better. Just to review some of the themes of that letter, one of our major concerns is the proper consideration of linear projects versus traditional construction projects at discrete locations. As I think most of you, if not all of you, are aware, the linear process is one of excavation, trenching through soil or trenching through impervious surfaces on local streets, performing the necessary work, and then refilling the trench as you go and as you move. If you were to consider this piece of paper as the footprint for a traditional construction project, you might want to consider this as the footprint for a linear project as it continues. They can be short, they can be long, they can be less than a mile, they can be many miles. So some of the features that are considered for the traditional projects perhaps are not the best criterion to be applied to linear projects. And in that consideration, let me just provide you with one example. The linear project is exempt from post-construction requirements in the linear construction general permit. We believe that exemption is appropriate and should be recognized in this permit as well. Another theme is that utilities utilities engage in non-stormwater discharges from routine maintenance and emergency service restoration projects. This work is performed under MPDES permits. That these are not, quote, illicit discharges. The staff has made some changes in that regard to the draft. There's still a few others that need to be recognized and made. We also need to consistently distinguish between, quote, significant source of pollutants and those that are not significant. So this shows up in one or two places in the draft as well. The third and the last theme that I'd like to leave you with is the identification and reconsideration of unnecessary requirements on linear projects that add to project cost and delay, and that we do not believe necessarily relate to improved water quality outcomes. And examples of that I would provide the pre-construction inspection requirement by small MS4 before the start of work. We think that is unnecessary and it could lead to delay and higher costs. And the requirement to have all permits before the start of any work. We're not sure if that just means grading type permits or if it extends to traffic and encroachment permits. And as you recall, these projects can be quite long, and and because of that length, they may take a lot of time, and it may not be practical to have all permits ready before you start working on day one. With that, I'd like to ask Fred to step up and continue our SWRCB comments, and I think both of us will be available for questions if you have any. Fred.
Good morning, or good afternoon. My name is Fred Jacobson, and I'll just continue basically where Bob left off. The first issue that I wanted to speak on had to do with the post-construction requirements, and the permit as it's written post-construction measures are triggered when a project creates or replaces more than a specific threshold amount of impervious surface, and These measures apply equally to both traditional construction projects and linear underground overhead projects, or LUPs as they're referred to in the construction general permit. And as Bob mentioned, the construction general permit does draw a distinction between the linear and the traditional type projects, and specifically with post-construction requirements. Traditional projects, because of their footprint, they're all of their new impervious surfaces would be located in a single location, whereas, as Bob illustrated with a linear project, any kind of new impervious surfaces, which are small, would be spread out over the length of a long project. And think of things like power poles or small utility boxes. Those are the kinds of new impervious surfaces that we're considering here. And the other thing is that we do, when we're working in streets, we do cut and remove existing asphalt, put our facilities in, and then replace that. So in terms of new impervious surfaces or replaced impervious surfaces under LUPS, there really isn't significant amounts of new impervious surfaces or increased runoff from our project areas. So our SWRCB's request in their letter is that LUPS be exempted from these measures, or at the very least that if for some reason there was an area on a LUP that had a concentrated area of new impervious surface, that these requirements would only apply in those locations. Second issue that I want to address is the discharge of MPDS permitted discharges of non-stormwater to MS4s that then discharge to ASBSs. And the board did adopt an exception for these types of discharges in last March. And there are just two requests that we would have on how that's implemented into this permit. The first is just a formatting issue. In the attachment C, where the requirements are included for ASBSs, the language for underground utility vaults was put in a way that's not consistent with the exception. I know that's hard, I'm not explaining that well, but it's a formatting issue. I think it's fairly simple to correct. And the effect of the way that it's now worded is that we could only do these discharges if they were for emergency purposes, and that's not the way that it was set up in the exception in March.
If I can just interject quickly, that was simply a formatting error and something we've caught and will correct before it's adopted.
Oh, thank you. And the second request on this is that we do appreciate the fact that there is now language in there that would authorize the discharge of underground discharges of non-stormwater from underground structures and vaults to MS4s that then discharge the ASBSs. But we would really like to see that expanded to other types of short, intermittent discharges of non-stormwater that could include things like hydrotest dewatering or potable water flushing types. And these would be projects that already have MPDS permits and have conditions that they have to meet in order to be able to discharge in the first place. So we would like to see that expanded in this permit. Bob mentioned our comment about construction site plan review and approval. The way that the permit is currently written, the erosion and sediment control plans would have to list all of the permits that are required for the project. Linear type projects could be very long. There are many different types of permits that are required. They could be as simple as traffic control permits, or in some cases we may have sewer discharge permits. Those typically aren't received until we're actually doing work in the specific areas. So to have those for entire project before we actually start construction is, I think, unnecessary, and we would like to see that requirement removed. And then there is a requirement that inspections be conducted by the MS4 at construction sites that start during the rainy season before any soil disturbing activities start. We'd like to see that removed as well. Projects that are under the construction general permit already have an extensive set of requirements in terms of what needs to be implemented before we actually start construction. Small MS4s, we're concerned, may have limited staff to do these types of inspections, and we're concerned that that would extend or delay project starts. And the last comment that I want to make on is that the permit requires that final stabilization and all temporary control measures be removed prior to authorization of occupancy. And the concern there is that in certain areas where, depending on soil types and time of the year that the project ends, it could be a long time before you reach the final stabilization criteria in the construction general permit. And to delay occupancy or for that period of time does not seem to be reasonable or necessary as well. So that's the end of my comments, and I think Bob's comments, if you have any questions.
I just have a question for staff, which is some of the linear permit issues that have been raised, we've talked about a bunch. Do you think have you dealt with them in this permit? I'm sorry, I wasn't focusing on this when I actually looked at the materials, but there seem to be an awful lot of logical suggestions these guys have made. I'm wondering why they have to make them, whether they just don't understand what's in the permit, or you guys feel there's something you need to do about linear permits in this particular, because these are construction projects, what you need to do in this permit. Not that I don't like seeing you, Bob, all the time, but I'm wondering why he has to keep coming on some of these things. Or can you have a conversation and handle some of these?
I think we can definitely have, we've already talked to Bob and Fred and other stakeholders about, some of the issues in these permits. I think, one of the critical differences with this permit and the construction permit is that it's an impervious surface threshold that sort of triggers people to do things, as opposed to the construction permit, which is saying if you disturb more than an acre, it's pretty much just disturbed area as opposed to impervious. So, but their point about sort of constraining, looking at that contiguous 2,500 square foot of impervious or 5,000 square foot impervious, I mean, that's a good comment. That's something we dealt with Caltrans, and I honestly don't see any reason why we should be treating linears differently under the Phase 2 permit than we do under Caltrans. And we have some specific language in here that talks about, in the Caltrans permit, redevelopment does not include trenching and basic utility work, and that's something we can look at, try to incorporate that. So
that's good. I think, conceptually, the linear project, that impervious surface that they're replacing, as to use our term, they don't own. They may have an easement, but they're not really in control. It's another jurisdiction that manages the road and that sort of thing. So, the intent here